you today on behalf of ROOL about what's been happening with RISC-OS Open in the last year or so, what we've got today, and roughly where things are going in the future. And hopefully, at the end, you might have some questions if you've got any time left, or there'll be time for sandwiches very shortly. Okay, if you were asleep for the last year, I'm going to give a quick run through of the things that RISC-OS Open has been up to in the last year. There's quite a lot of slides in this deck, so I'm probably going to skip through some of them quite quickly. Back in August last year, we happened to spot the 20th birthday of the Internet module, which is in RISC-OS, so our networking stack is getting quite old enough I think it's old enough to drive an HGV. I think that was the significance of the 20th birthday, is you can now get an HGV license. So I don't think it's quite acoustic coupler time, but certainly in 1997, dial-up was very common. And there's a lot of technologies that have been added since then. This list isn't made up. I didn't pluck this out of the sky. This was what I was doing on this laptop while I was writing this slide. So I was doing a bank transfer for someone that I owe some money to. I was copying files using Windows sharing, using the SMB2 protocol. Obviously, so it happens to be a wireless laptop. And naturally, I was streaming cat videos at the same time. Everyone loves a cat video. So RISC-OS is missing out on quite a lot of those things. I couldn't really point at that I can do any of those on RISC-OS at the moment. So I'll come back to the network stack a little bit later on, but that was what was happening in August. If you were not at the London show in October, we released a new version of the BBC Basic Reference Manual. That was last published in 1992. Oddly, also October. There's something about Octobers that are important. This reference manual has been updated to talk about the latest version of BBC Basic in RISC-OS, which also includes VFP as an acronym for vector floating point. So whenever there is a floating point calculation, you're working on a real variable in BASIC, there is a version now that will try and use the floating point accelerator that's in the modern ARM processors. And little fact of the day, and it's possible that we'll have sold out by the time I get back to the stand, that's now the most popular book that we've sold to date. There's also an interesting little backstory in the amount of effort that was required to convince the BBC to allow us to use the BBC Basic name in a newly published book, because the brand guardians at the BBC are very scared if you mention the word BBC in anything. So we were able to get in touch with a lawyer somewhere. I think she was, I can't remember what her surname was, but she had an amusing surname and was able to give us permission to use the BBC name in a publication. And it's also the first book where we've managed to convince Amazon to list it on their website. I believe, I know a lot of people go to the ROOL website. I think more people probably go to Amazon. So it's been a very useful bit of exposure for RISC-OS titles. Now that it was briefly about the 15,000th most popular book on Amazon for about a day. I think that was someone bought 2. Then just slightly after the show, I think we might have had it at the show, the new version of the desktop tools came out. So this is the desktop development environment that programmers use to write C and compiled BASIC and assembler programs that you're all used to using. So if you're not a developer, this isn't desperately interesting. If you are a developer, then this is what we crammed into that new version, including electronic copies of the book box set that we used to sell, which are obviously nice and easy to search. If you've got a keyword in mind, you can't quite remember where it is, searching the electronic copies is a lot quicker than leafing through the paper copy. There have been 2 minor updates to that since then. A couple of new features to the inline assembler. You can now insert a breakpoint instruction, which is very useful if you're trying to debug something. You can use the C compiler to stick a breakpoint in. And also, if you're trying to detect on the fly whether to do a 32-bit or a 26-bit version of some software, you can also now compare the program counter in the inline assembler. And there's some bits of bug fixes along the way. So programmers are excited by that. Everyone else, not very excited. And just before Christmas, I think possibly even just the week before Christmas, the USB bounty, which is part 1 of 2 that we have open, was completed. Now, some of this is slightly dull administrative work, moving software around in the way that it's managed in RISC-OS, splitting modules up so that they're slightly more maintainable, writing documentation. None of it's glamorous, but it's all something that has been historically missing. Some of the work involved bringing fixes over from NetBSD, which is a Unix-like operating system, which is where the RISC-OS USB stack originally came from. So NetBSD has been wandering on in their own path since RISC-OS took its last copy. RISC-OS has wandered off in the other direction. So there's been a little bit of effort to try and steer them back towards each other, because there's a lot more people developing for NetBSD. So if we can take advantage of their changes, so they have things like USB 3 support, then bringing those back into our copy of the stack greatly enhances our software for relatively little effort. So if there's 100 programmers working on NetBSD and only 2 on RISC-OS, then we might as well get those 100 people to do as much work for us as possible. Everyone's lazy. And then under the bonnet, there's some low-level bits and bobs where, if you were very careful, you might have noticed before on RISC-OS that the keyboard lock LED would flash twice at startup. That's because it used to work by having 1 copy of the keyboard driver in the hardware abstraction layer, that's what HAL's short for, and then another copy of the keyboard driver in the main OS. So it would end up having to restart the keyboard twice. So some of this shuffling around has allowed that now only happens once, so it boots up faster, and it's a lot more reliable if you have, for example, a hub in the way of the keyboard. That didn't, hubs used to confuse things greatly, but it doesn't anymore. Nudging over into this year, the aim of getting a new version of RISC-OS out for Christmas sailed past and was waved off into the distance as January started, so Christmas didn't quite happen. And this is the first release of RISC-OS where there's been an attempt to formalize the process of how to decide what's stable and what's not stable. I personally greatly dislike the term because, for me, the opposite of stable is unstable. That's not what's trying to be said here. The opposite, what we're trying to say is it's a port that is complete and meets all of the stable release criteria, but that's not to say that any other version crashed a lot. Clearly that's not the case. Not all, but most of the nightly builds that you can download from ROOL's website work just fine. There's very rarely any that actually have such big humdinger problems that they crash. So this is very much about formalizing the process. Previously in RISC-OS 5.22 and 5.20 and 5.18, there was kind of a gentleman's agreement and some handshaking, and no one really knew what was required to be classed as a new release. So that's an important step for this, that it's actually a published set of criteria that everyone can see and read, and very transparent. I'm just noticing there that the traffic light scheme, so this is on ROOL's website if you want to go and have a look at it, says weekly update. My maths says 26 minus the second. That's definitely not a weekly update. A roughly weekly update, maybe 24 days occasionally. Exciting stuff in the news. If you don't recognize this bloke, his name's there. It's Mr. Zuckerberg. He's the head of the Facebook corporation, and he's in a bit of trouble at the moment for misappropriating or misusing everyone's data and sharing it around in a way that wasn't expected. And there's a lot of heat on him at the moment because of data security. And as it happens, there is a bounty where we're trying to address some of those issues that RISC-OS has in security and data security, because they're there and they're quite big as well. I was amused to see in the paper the following day. This is just a side story. So he's got quite a lot of shares in Facebook, as you can imagine. He formed the company. And he did such a good job of convincing Congress that there was no problem, nothing to see here. His share values went up by $5 billion during that day. So he's the man to get money from. He's got lots, or 5 billion more than he had the previous day. Anyway, so yeah, tying into that very nicely, in March 2018, so only last month or so, the TCP/IP bounty, TFIN, step 1 of 4, which is mainly a security focus. So there are some additional steps which I'll touch on briefly later on, but this initial step is about sorting out some of the gaping security holes that RISC-OS has so that we don't end up in front of Congress. That would be sad. And the two that are coming hopefully soonish, as in maybe by May, that kind of time frame, are creating a replacement for the Acorn SSL module, which deals with secure transactions, for example, if you're going to a banking website, that sort of thing. But a lot of websites now, even just a Google search, will default to going to a secure copy of the website. And that's something that we don't currently have even vaguely up to date for RISC-OS, as in we're probably 18 or 19 years out of date. So the security protocols, often you'll hear SSL. Do not use SSL anymore. That's so easily cracked now. Even just my wristwatch could probably crack SSL. It's at the time, it was very advanced. 1999, 1998, it was a very advanced protocol because computers were correspondingly slow then. Today, yeah, SSL you can crack in a few hours very easily, and I can get all your bank details. Thank you very much. So TLS is what its replacement is. I do not remember what that acronym is short for. Something layer security, maybe? Thank you. There's somebody who knows what it's short for. So that's one of the important changes. And some of this stuff has been feeding through already. So in the latest versions of the Internet application that you can download from ROOL's website, there is now a list, an up-to-date list of trusted certificate authorities. So that's how, when you want to do a secure exchange, you need to have a dialogue with the server and say, who are you then? And then, oh, okay, I see who you are. And then you have to go and ask someone else to check that the certificate that they've given you is valid. There's no point in just giving you I have swum 50 meters in the deep end. That's not a useful certificate. It needs to be one that has been issued by a trusted authority. So that database is now in the hard disk. And then there's some bits of periphery around in this bounty which are to do with getting software ready in the future for some of the later steps. So IPv6 addressing, which is where we get, we bust out of the 32-bit network address space. That's not actually coming along until possibly even the 4th step. I can't remember which one it is exactly, but certainly much later on in the series. But it's something that we can make the change now so that programmers are ready for when that comes. You can make use of the function calls straight away, even if there's no support behind it for IPv6 yet. So, on to things that are now up to date. I think we're in April. Yes, after March into April. So this is the new version of RISC-OS 5, which is on our stand today, and depending on whether Steve's got out of bed yet, it should be on the website as well, if not in the next day or so. I was interested to see it's actually been so long that April 2015 was the last main release, that it didn't even have the JPEG bounty in it. And I remember talking to, perhaps not this audience, but I remember talking at this show, not this year, it must have been in 2016, about this bounty. So that gives you an idea for quite how long it's been since the last stable release with all these bits shoehorned in. So they've been in intermediate releases along the way, so you'd be able to use it on the Raspberry Pi, for example, but this is the first one pulling all the bits together. For hardware that has support for auto-detecting the monitor, which doesn't seem to be working on my laptop today for some reason. The EDID monitor configuration stuff is in, so this is work from bounties. You just heard me talking about the USB bounty, and then I've just mentioned the stuff on the security bounty. And the last one is a few little bits. There is the paint bounty is currently underway, but it's not yet finished. So little features there, like you can now do press control and use the scroll wheel to zoom. So little bits of things are dribbling through, even though those bounties aren't quite finished yet. Now this is where there's a sequence of about 10 slides here, so I'm not going to bore you all with them. But there's a few features along the way. This is the stuff on the hard disk, so we now have an NFS client, so you can connect to Unix computers, and in particular, I think Apple Macs also support NFS. So if you've got an Apple Mac and you're trying to share files with that, you should be able to use the NFS client to connect to that. See if you can spot the bit that's my personal interest, eConnect. No, just me then. Yeah, so you can now connect using OmniClient to an Ethernet server. I suspect it's just me that's doing that. There we go, two people. There we go, audience of two. There's also the application Access Plus has reappeared, so if you've got a small network of RISC-OS computers, you can designate one as a server without having to actually set up a dedicated file server. You can say, this one's a normal RISC-OS computer, but also it should share files. So that application got lost somewhere in 32-bitting around sort of year 2000, but it was found under a stone. As a TFTP client, I've mentioned the trusted certificates. The RISC-OS 2 Porterhouse font, also found under the same stone. So that's come back. Bits to support the bounty work, so EDID and other changes in the OS have required us to make some small changes to configure. There are some tutorials that, again, got lost somewhere in the mid-90s that have been rediscovered. So tutorials to allow you to learn how to use draw properly, for example. Oops, skip past 2 there. Yeah, more application changes. Particularly, HForm can now format to a finer granularity. So if you've got a really big hard disk, if you try and create a really small file on it, at the moment you end up with quite a big amount of space wasted. So if say you created a 2-byte file, you'll find that actually it took 64K on disk. So HForm can now improve on that and save you some disk space, or make more efficient use of your disk space. But again, the proper change logs are on ROOL's website. There's 654 things in them to read through, and I'm conscious of my sandwiches, so I'm not going to read through all 654 of them. Similarly, at the ROM end, that's a very whistle-stop tour through those. The chars application, or characters application, can now look through Unicode fonts rather than being stuck in the monospace system font. Those bits from Paint, the Paint bounty are dribbling through. The VFP, the Vector Floating Point Accelerated version of BASIC that I mentioned a few slides earlier. DOSFS is now a bit more tolerant. If you try and plug in a disk it doesn't understand, it will just leave it alone. Previously, it would have a go at it and then crash horribly. So that's been sorted out. FileCore can mount drives up to 2 terabytes in size. LAMNFS, which is the filing system to talk to Windows, will now do, or it's not, I wouldn't say secure. It's sort of slightly secure. NTLM sharing is better than a plain text password, but it's, again, still, you could crack it on a wristwatch in a few minutes. But it at least allows you to connect to Windows 7 and Windows 10, which no longer allows plain text passwords at all. And the JPEG, I showed you the parrot picture earlier, so you know all about JPEG. Under the bonnet, if you're interested in programming, you can now use what are known as physical memory pools, PMP. Lovely set of initials. The upshot for that right now is that you can have a much bigger RAM disk than previously, so you can get 512 megabyte RAM disk if you've got the RAM, of course. So previously that was limited to 128 meg, so that limitation has been lifted. A lot of speed ups to do with the way that sprites and the caches are managed. Get more useful error messages if things go wrong. If you've ever seen an error box that just says offla, offla, offla in it, a few nods, yeah, it's definitely, so at least one person will have seen an offla, offla, offla error message. So the kernel will now check on return from a SWI if something went wrong, and it'll look at your error pointer and go, that looks a bit offla, offla, offla. And it will substitute it for one that it generates and says, yeah, there's something gone wrong there. No more offla, offla, offla. In terms of hardware support, and I've kind of crunched these together, that they're spread across all of the platforms, of course. You can probe I2 C buses, EDID we've already talked about for auto-detecting your monitor's capabilities. CDFS working with a wider range of, or wider manufacturers' drives. So many bug fixes that I'm not going to bore you with them. Again, on the website there are some exciting change logs with 708 lines that you can enjoy at your leisure. It's boiled down, these are the sort of 20 odd top ones. Most of them will make your eyes bleed. Don't worry about them too much. I've had a few questions on the stand today about that 0-page thing. I definitely talked at a previous show about a ticking time bomb that was likely to explode if Penfold doesn't warn you of it. 0-page thing, in my mind, it's useful to split it into three. There's the ARM vectors, there's the kernel's private workspace, and then there's bugs in applications. So when we used to have a piece of RAM down at 0-page, you were never able to write to the ARM vectors since the RISC PC, which I kind of forgotten about, but I think I knew. So what we've done is modern ARMs have a facility to move those somewhere completely different so that you can't accidentally trample over them and stiff the machine. So nobody should notice those moving because since the RISC PC, you haven't been able to write to them anyway. The kernel workspace, again, it's all private variables that generally nobody really knew or you shouldn't have known what they were being used for. So again, unless it was an accidental access, then no one should notice the kernel workspace moving. So the only class of thing that might be upset by 0-page are buggy applications that accidentally read from 0-page. And again, we were kind of halfway there from Phoebe, or what would have been Phoebe. So RISC-OS 4 onwards, you could not write to 0-page from user mode, so from an application, but you could read. So there's quite a big class of applications where if you make when you're writing software, it's very easy to lose track of a variable when you're writing it, and you end up reading from an address of 0 by mistake. So in order to help those eke another few more months out of those applications that haven't been fixed yet, I'd say a lot, if not all, have been tended to, because we gave 34 months of advance warning. So July 2015, this strategy was announced, so that we have now left a page of RAM with not very much in it down at address 0. So no one should notice that being a problem because you couldn't write them since the RISC PC. The kernel workspace is the kernel's workspace, none of your business. And buggy applications can still, if they want to, accidentally read from 0-page and no one will notice. So hopefully, although the bomb is still ticking, it's been thrown down a little black hole for a few more months. I should put my advertising hat on. So on the stand today, we have RISC-OS Epic, which is the version of RISC-OS that comes on a 16 gigabyte SD card. So that's obviously got RISC-OS 5.24 with it. We've also updated SparkFS, Photodesk, and the Impact database. And RISC-OS Open as contribution on Epic is the desktop development environment, which you saw me a few slides earlier talking about. So the very latest DDE 28 is now also included on Epic. So it's brought fully up to date with both the OS and the applications. The thing called Noobs, which is new out of the box software, is a SD card that is shipped when you buy a Raspberry Pi from a retail outlet. So not from a RISC-OS one. So if you're going to, I was going to say Matlin, but yeah. If you go into somewhere like Matlin that sells Raspberry Pis, it will normally come with a Noobs card in the box for you. And a while ago, probably in 2016 or so, RISC-OS fell off the back of Noobs. They either ran out of space or they didn't want it, or we were not able to provide it, possibly all three. So hopefully with some sweet talking of the Pi Foundation, it should be possible to get RISC-OS back onto the default distribution that everyone buys when they buy a Raspberry Pi. So people who are interested but not interested enough to come to a show and buy the cards in person can, with just a couple of mouse clicks, install RISC-OS on their Raspberry Pi and give it a try. So if they don't like it, doesn't matter, click erase, reinstall something else. But it's important that as many people or as many eyeballs are getting to see RISC-OS as possible. And the user guide, I think I also talked about this, no, maybe Steve was here last year, yes. So Steve talked about this at Wakefield show last year. So this is another in the book publishing initiative, part of the ROOL book empire. trying to get our stats higher up the Amazon website. And I do have the actual book in person. So these are available ka-ching on our stand today. I want to mention that. Stretching to 600 pages. Now, this is the amusing copy that every alternate page is bound upside down by mistake. So those ones got sent back to the printers. So the ones on the stand are definitely the right way up. You don't need to stand on your head to read them. So the tutorial material, as I mentioned, is now on the hard disk to support that. So there's big sections in both the paint and the draw chapter describing how to use all the weird features of paint and draw that you never knew about, like drawing arrowheads and getting them to line up nicely. And some useless statistics at the bottom, 924 illustrations. So there's lots of, in fact, more pictures than there are pages. Does that make sense? Yeah, there's more than one picture on a page. Yeah, that makes sense. Statistics looked a bit dubious. Now, on to bounties. Not that type of bounty, the type of bounty where you give ROOL money. The idea behind the bounty scheme, as I think you've probably heard before, is to try and roll up some of the larger tasks that can't easily be fitted into weekend-sized bites. So most of the things when I'm fiddling with Econet, that's because I can fit that into a weekend. The bounties are all about doing much bigger chunks of work where you're having to take some time off work to implement them because they're either too complicated to fit in your 2-day weekend-sized head or because the sheer amount of work required is much longer than that. So they're all driven by the community. So the money comes from people donating to the bounties or a bounty of their choice. But if there's something that you think is missing from RISC-OS, then there's also a bounties forum where you can suggest your own for the future. If there's a feature that you think the OS should have but no one's noticed. The problem with the bounties, I guess, is that if they're driven only by what ROOL is thinking, they tend to come out as a load of programmery things, because people in ROOL are all programmery people. So it's important that actual users say what it is that they can't do on RISC-OS. Otherwise you get some more programming things. This was an interesting article, curiously timed on the 18th of April, announcing that the very last block of IPv4 addresses has been dished out to someone in Africa, I think, or Asia Pacific. Yeah, Asia Pacific. So the IPv4 address space, which is your normal internet addresses where it's A.B.C, a four dotted number, they've all now run out because there's only 4 billion of them, and clearly there's more than 4 billion computers in the world, despite what IBM predicted. And now there's a new scheme to use IPv6 addressing, which has 128 bits, so it's a much longer address space. And there's something like you could have one IP address for every grain of sand on the beach, or something like that. There's trillions and trillions of addresses, and effectively they're unlimited. That was an interesting article that ties in quite nicely to the TCP/IP bounty. So these are the stats as at yesterday afternoon when I was gathering the numbers. So the bounties that are currently open are the updates to the C compiler to support more of the ARM v7 instruction set. Now, I know from the glazed look when I was talking about the DDE earlier, there's not a lot of programmers here, and that's fine. You might not be using the compiler itself, but you are almost certainly using the programs that the compiler generates. So don't be thinking in your mind that that's a programmery one. It is also, if you're running applications, they could be smaller, they could be faster. All those good things if that bounty could get kicked off. The filing system improvements is about adding partitioning support so that we can share disks with other operating systems. So if you're booting into Linux, you could also boot into RISC-OS, and the two don't fight over disk space. And that goes back to what I was saying about the new out-of-box memory card for the Raspberry Pi. The reason why that's always such a pain in the bum is because RISC-OS is having to sit in a special section of the disk in order that it will work, because we don't interoperate with Linux partitions. Clipboard support is to extend what we currently do in Edit, where you can Control-C, Control-V between applications. So Paint and Draw also could support a clipboard, so you could copy text from Edit and then it would appear in your Draw drawing, for example. And also similarly in desktop icons. So if you've got a dialog box which you want to stick somebody's email address in or something like that, you could copy it from your text file and paste it into the dialog box. So those are tidying up the bits of things in the desktop that don't support the clipboard. The RISC-OS general one is just kind of a pooling ground for when attending shows, that sort of thing, paying for the costs of the servers. TCP/IP stack was the one that I was mentioning earlier, is our 20-year mission to colonize new worlds with up-to-date networking software. And then the last one is part 2 of the USB bounty, where we're aiming to drag in the rest of the changes from the NetBSD Foundation with all the good stuff that they've been working on in the last few years. So I'm quite pleased from a mathematics point of view. I'm an engineer, I like maths. The average donation values are higher than I was expecting, I think. Quite pleasing. And some of them are reaching, they're getting to the halfway point. I'm just going to 5, 10. It's about 50 people in this room, so if you each gave £50, that'd be very nice. That's £2,500. That would clear a couple of these bounties off the list. So always, we can also now take card payments at the stand. I should mention that. So stick it on the credit card. Worry about it next year. Don't worry about it. £1,000. No one knows. And of course, the very night after RISC-OS 5.24 was finished, the next set of RISC-OS 5.25 popped out of the nightly builder. So every night there's a server somewhere in, I'm not sure actually, it's in the cloud somewhere. There's a server that regenerates RISC PC, Raspberry Pi, IMX6 one board, Titanium, Beagle board, Panda board, and Ionix ROM. So every morning you can test the latest and greatest. Sometimes they might crash a little bit, don't worry about that. And hopefully, I need to have a discussion with Chris Evans today. The OMAP 5 ROM should be joining that list as well very shortly. So, big stuff. Having moved all the workspace out of the way and shuffled the memory map round and got all the ducks in a line, it's paving the way for some multi-core support. So a lot of ARM processors now, certainly anything since 2010 onwards, will have at least 2 processor cores, sometimes 4. The Raspberry Pi 3 that came out in March this year has 4 1.4 gigahertz processor cores on it. Currently RISC-OS is only using 1 of them, so it could run 4 times. Yep, yeah, okay. Spreading out both of the icon bar on both monitors means that you need to do a lot of mouse miles in order to get from the applications on the right-hand side to the disk drives on the left-hand side. So most operating systems sort that out by either duplicating the icon bar, for example, or you only have it on one preferred video head. Little bits like that need sorting out in the window manager. So that was all I had to say. I'm open to any questions. I'm particularly interested, I guess, as I said earlier, a lot of what ROOL does is probably very blinkered and programming related. It's always interesting to know what's ROOL doing badly, what's missing, what are the things that non-programmers are interested in. So I'll open the questions. Yes, so the Access Plus that you saw earlier is about being able to designate one of your 2 computers as essentially a mini file server. So you can still use it as a normal computer, but if you run the Access Plus software on it, you designate a set of directories which you can then see from the other one. So it acts in if you imagine like a school or an office environment, you would have a designated Access server sitting in a cupboard, and then you would have client computers for it. The idea of Access Plus is that you don't need the one that's in the cupboard. One of the 2 that you're using is the designated server, but it's also a normal computer.
Because I find reliability is missing at the moment. Very rarely am I able to share stuff between 2 computers.
Yes, so with ShareFS, sharing things is, there's a 2-pronged problem there. First one is that ShareFS currently uses UDP, which is the User Datagram Protocol, which is not a guaranteed service. So it just throws packets out of the door, and if the other end isn't ready to receive them, it doesn't matter. They fall on the floor and they're gone. Tough. So one way to solve that would be to change ShareFS to use TCP/IP, which has a grade of service, so you know that the packet got there. That's one option. The other one, in terms of not being able to see disks on when you mark one as shared, that's usually caused by the net mask being set up wrong. I've seen that quite a lot because I have a trying to think what it's called now. I have an ADSL router that has a slightly weird view of which address ranges are for which. So whenever I set it up to have a network with addresses beginning 10, for some reason it wants to use a net mask of 255.255.255.0, which then means anyone else who's using a network of 10 will have a different net mask, and then they can't talk to each other. So those are the two most common problems with ShareFS, is you can't see the disk at all, and that's usually a net mask problem. And if you can see the disk, you can't transfer files, and that will be UDP problem. So, yeah. Okay.
Looking to the future, obviously 5.24 came out now and 5.22 came out in 3 years. Do you have a future roadmap which says 5.26 will ship when we have these features, or do you have a yearly target, a target date in mind for future developments?
What we've tended to do in the past is work based on time. So at some point I plotted how long it was between RISC-OS 3.5, 3.6, 3.7, RISC-OS 4, I guess, along the way. And they're roughly 18 months to 2 years kind of cycle. Now, for Acorn, they were largely driven by, oh crap, the strong arms come out, we quickly better fix our OS to make it work on a strong arm, rather than features that they were adding. It was always driven by, oh, there's a new machine come out. So, yeah, we've tended to be more time-based, as in you get to 2 years, you say, well, yeah, we've got 10 new things that are worth having, let's roll those up into a release, rather than, yeah, so there's not a, or I'm not aware of, a shopping list of saying, great, well, when we can run on 4 cores, then that'll be 5.26. There's not a roadmap in that sense, no. It's time-driven still.
5.26.
Yeah, so about 2 years is about the right amount of time, yeah.
I'm interested in the 24-25 thing. I've got an IMX6. I've got a letter from Andrew Rawnsley saying he's not going to do 24, and the IMX is going to do 25. I should ask him probably, is that still a low vector one?
I don't know. All of the RISC-OS 5.25s on ROOL's website are now, or have been for 3 years, high vector copies. So I would expect it was high vector. That would be my.
I think Andrew produces low vector for his machines, and he's produced, I assume, the 25 would be low vector. He says because his customers don't like something that ROOL is doing. He wouldn't be clear about it. You're making demands that his customers don't like, so he can't issue 24, the RMX6.
So there's a different issue. So trying to find there. So when the stable release criteria were published in 2016 and then evaluated in, trying to read the own. So yeah, so each of the ports were given a traffic light scheme on the 27th of January, according to that teeny-weeny little capture website. And yes, there were a shopping list of things that needed to be done on each of the ports in order to meet the stable release criteria. And in the end, the IMX6, which is what the RMX6 ultimately runs on, and the OMAP5 didn't manage to complete their criteria in time. So that's why those two in particular don't have a 5.24. But then if there's a 5.25 that Andrew's shipping instead, which sounds like it is, then I would imagine that would be a high vectors one the same, unless it's doing something magic. I don't.
Okay, I'll ask him.
Yeah, I guess I'm trying to find that slide now. How's it gone? There we go. So I guess the point that I skipped over when I was here is part of what ROOL is trying to do is to try and get one step ahead of the fire. When Acorn knew in 1996, when the ARM6 came out, that 32-bit mode was a thing, and they did absolutely nothing about it until we ran out of 26-bit processors, and then Acorn went bust. So they kind of dug their own grave there a little bit.
So 32-bit really came and bit RISC-OS on the bum, and I'd probably say it nearly killed it. ARM v7 is the next set of coming and biting you on the bum, because that stopped you doing rotated loads and all the other bits and bobs that I'm now forgetting. But ARM v7 had another set of incompatibilities. Acorn at the time might have been big enough to convince ARM to add or leave features in, but ROOL isn't big enough. ARM decide what's happening with the ARM architecture. We have absolutely no influence. And we've seen that with ARM v8 when that came out, and the swap instruction disappeared, and that caused a load of applications to stop working. We've known that swap's been deprecated for at least 5 years, maybe even 10, and did nothing about it. So what I'm envisaging, the fact that ARM have added a facility to allow you to move the vectors high, to me says that ARM will not allow you to have low vectors. That's probably what's going to happen. In fact, I suspect with ARM v8 you can't. I don't happen to know that, but I would imagine they generally, they will deprecate things, give you a few years' notice, and then it'll just vanish in the next processor. So part of this stuff to do with moving the zero-page stuff is to fix buggy applications. If they're writing to zero-page, then that's a variable that someone forgot to initialize, or it was initialized to 0. Messing with the kernel workspace makes RISC-OS crash very easily. And moving the ARM vectors, I think ARM are going to stop you doing that totally. So it's about ROOL is trying to get one step ahead of that fire this time. And it's allowing us, particularly with moving the kernel workspace, we're going to need to have several copies of the kernel workspace for multi-core, for example. So it needs moving, so we might as well try and move it now. But I'm not sure, with the addition of the compatibility page, where we've just got a block of RAM at the bottom that just does nothing, that should allow all of the any remaining applications which are a bit unhappy to carry on running, because there was a block of RAM there before, and there's still a block of RAM there. There should be no difference.
Okay, I'll ask Andrew.
Yeah, it sounds like an odd stance to have if you're. Yeah.
What he said was the people that are funding his ARMX6 wouldn't agree to some of the changes that ROOL wants to make the light go green. And he's paid by by the people who are paying for his development, so he's not going to go with 524 for the ARMX6.
Yeah.
So I just wanted to understand quite why, but
yeah.
I'll ask him.
Yeah, so yeah. Hopefully, and I think I mentioned it on at least one of the slides, that the criteria that were set out. Forwards or backwards? Forwards or backwards? No, it's before that. One with the traffic light. There we go. So yeah, the idea of pre-publishing a couple of years ago the criteria was so that it was the title. Oh, back to the front page. The keyword there, open. It's RISC-OS open. It's on our website. The criteria are there. Everyone can see. If you don't agree with the criteria, I can't help that, but it's on the website. That shut everyone up. Oh. Was I ranting?
I've got one for you, man with the mic. There's been talk of the bounty that's got the sources for 4 and 6 to merge into 5. Is this correct? Or is that an April Fool?
I don't know. I've not heard of such a bounty. I don't. Oh, okay. If it was before midday on the 1st of April, I suspect it might have been an April Fool. Yeah, it would be. It is a great shame, I guess, the OS split, and perhaps that goes back to John's question about people wandering off producing their own ROMs. RISC-OS 4, there's a lot of great stuff got added. RISC-OS 6, a lot of great stuff got added, and for whatever reason, the parties don't like talking to each other. Rules always there. You can send them an email. Forgotten the guy's name. Aaron.
Aaron,
yeah.
Yeah.
He can email ROOL any day of the week, and they'll have a meeting. I'm sure. There's no animosity between ROOL and anyone else. I'm sure I haven't met him myself, but I'm sure he's a lovely guy. I can't think of any reason not to try and tie something up, but I haven't heard anything coming in the other direction though. Okay, run out of questions. Well, if you form an orderly queue for giving me £50, I will put them straight into your bounty.
Yeah.
Thank
Thanks
you.
very much, Rob. Ta.